14 years old. That's all the age he had to offer the world when he walked into that juvenile courtroom with a smirk that made the entire gallery hold their breath. First-degree murder. The victim wasn't a stranger or a rival. It was his own mother. She had sacrificed everything for him. 2 jobs, sleepless nights, endless patience. And he sat there in that chair, handcuffed wrists beneath the table, rolling his eyes at the prosecutor's words as if the trial were a joke. He laughed when the judge called his name. He whispered jokes to his attorney. He genuinely believed his age would protect him, that his youth was a legal loophole. But he didn't know that inside that courtroom, one voice would prove louder than all his arrogance combined. Not the judge, not the jury. His own mother's voice, preserved in the evidence that was about to destroy him. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way, even when evil wears a young face. It shows us why accountability matters, why the system exists to protect the innocent and expose the guilty, regardless of their age. If you believe that no one should be above the law, subscribe now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a case where truth prevails over lies. And tell us in the comments below, should age ever protect someone from the weight of their actions? This is how it all began. His name was Marcus, born on a Tuesday morning in late spring, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket, wanted and loved, before he even opened his eyes. His mother's name was Catherine. She was 28 years old when she held him for the first time, and in that moment she made a silent promise that she would protect him from the world's cruelties. She never imagined that one day the world's cruelty would come wearing his face. Catherine worked 2 jobs. Every morning before sunrise, she'd pack his lunch: turkey sandwich, apple slices, a note that read, "You are loved." She believed in him completely. She believed that if she just loved him enough, worked hard enough, gave enough, he would become a good person. But love alone cannot raise a child who has decided he will not be raised. And by the time she realized that, it was far too late. The juvenile courtroom was silent in a way that silence shouldn't be. It was the kind of quiet that comes before something terrible is said aloud, or when everyone in the room understands that words are about to reshape someone's entire existence. The judge sat elevated at her bench, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on the boy in the defendant's chair. Marcus sat with his legs crossed, one sneaker swinging slightly beneath the table. The handcuffs around his wrists caught the fluorescent light. His attorney sat beside him, a grey-haired public defender, whose face had already surrendered to the weight of this case. The prosecutor stood, papers in hand, her voice steady as she read the charges. First-degree murder. 1 count. The victim, Catherine Marie Henderson, age 43. The location, her own home. The defendant, her biological son. When the prosecutor said the word matricide, Marcus smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a frightened smile. A genuine, a confident smile. The kind of smile a person gives when they believe they're about to win. The gallery behind him erupted in small, shocked movements. A relative gasped. Someone's chair scraped against the floor. The judge's gavel didn't come down, but her expression hardened. She was Judge Patricia Moore, a woman who had presided over 17 years of juvenile cases, and even she paused longer than necessary before she continued. She had seen angry children. She had seen terrified children. She had even seen remorseless children before. But there was something different about Marcus, something that transcended mere coldness. It was an absence, an emptiness where conscience should live. When the judge asked him how he pleaded, his attorney touched his arm and whispered something. Marcus leaned back in his chair with a small shrug. The gesture communicated everything. This doesn't matter. I don't matter. None of this matters. His attorney requested a moment to speak with him, and during that whispered conversation, Marcus rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. He genuinely looked bored. When the judge asked for his plea again, he said, "Not guilty," with all the emotional weight of someone ordering a sandwich. The courtroom absorbed the reality of his tone. Not guilty. Not a claim of innocence, but a declaration of defiance. The prosecutor, a woman named Sarah Chen, stood and began to outline the case that would unfold over the coming weeks. She spoke with practiced precision about the evening of March 15th, about a single gunshot fired in a residential neighborhood, about first responders arriving to find a woman dead in her kitchen and a 14-year-old boy sitting in the adjacent room, still holding a controller in his lap. She described how he had called 911, not immediately, not in panic, but after 17 minutes. 17 minutes during which he had continued playing his video game. 17 minutes of silence while his mother lay dying. The prosecutor's voice never wavered, but the room felt colder with each sentence. Parents in the gallery looked at their own children differently. They looked at Marcus the way one might look at a dangerous animal that hasn't yet decided whether it's hungry. The judge watched his reaction to the prosecutor's words with the intensity of someone looking for a crack in his facade, some small sign that the weight of reality had finally reached him. It never came. Marcus picked at his fingernail. He yawned once, briefly covering his mouth with a hand that was not quite covered by the cuff of his orange detention shirt. During the preliminary statements, the defense attorney made the obvious argument: his age. At 14, his brain was still developing. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for impulse control and consequence evaluation, was incomplete. This was not an excuse, the attorney said, but a reality that must be considered. Marcus was a child, legally and biologically. The judge nodded, understanding. Juvenile law existed for reasons, but juvenile law also had limits, and first-degree murder was among them. The prosecutor stood and simply said, "The evidence will show intent, deliberation, and a complete absence of remorse. The evidence will show that this was not an accident. This was not a moment of teenage recklessness. This was planned, and this was executed." The word executed hung in the air, and finally, something flickered in Marcus's expression. Not guilt, not fear, just a recognition that someone had named the truth he'd been trying to hide. The prosecutor continued, outlining the digital evidence that would be introduced: deleted searches on his phone, messages to friends, voice recordings he'd made after the shooting. One video clip, she said, would be particularly damaging. He'd filmed himself minutes after his mother fell. The prosecutor didn't say what was in that video. She didn't need to. The courtroom understood that whatever image existed on that phone had already convicted him in every way that mattered. The judge scheduled the trial to begin the following Monday. As the bailiff stood to lead Marcus away, the boy stood with surprising confidence, as if he were about to leave a dentist's appointment rather than walk toward a process that would determine whether he spent decades behind bars. He looked back at the gallery once. His grandmother sat in the third row, her face destroyed by grief. His uncle sat beside her, one arm around her shoulders, his eyes red and fixed on the floor. Marcus showed them no acknowledgement. He showed them nothing. A moment before he disappeared through the door, he did something that would later become the focal point of public outrage. He smiled. Not to anyone specific, not as a gesture of defiance necessarily, but as if something amused him internally. As if the entire courtroom, the charges, the evidence, the truth about what he had done, all of it was somehow funny. The bailiff's hand on his arm didn't wipe that smile away. As the metal door closed behind him, that smile was the last thing the court saw. And in that moment, every person in that room understood that they were not dealing with a frightened child who had made a terrible mistake. They were dealing with something far more dangerous. Catherine Marie Henderson's alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning, every morning, without exception, even weekends, even when she was sick, even when her back ached from the 12 hours she'd worked the day before at the hospital, where she cleaned patient rooms and changed linens and pretended not to hear the conversations about the families who could afford better accommodations. She'd lie in bed for exactly 90 seconds. That was the amount of time she allowed herself to feel tired. And then she'd rise. She'd shower in the dark to save electricity. She'd dress in her work uniform for the restaurant where she served breakfast and lunch shifts. And then, before she left the house at 5:15, she'd go into Marcus's room. He'd be sleeping, usually on his back, one arm thrown across his face. When he was small, she'd kiss his forehead. As he got older and began to pull away from such affection, she'd simply stand there for a moment, watching him breathe, reminding herself on why she was willing to destroy her body for minimum wage and tips. This boy, this child she'd carried and birthed and raised alone, he was why she moved. He was why she worked. He was why anything mattered. She loved him with the kind of love that asks nothing in return, and that love was both her greatest strength and her fatal blindness. The neighbors on Maple Street remembered Catherine as the woman who was always leaving and always returning, always tired and always trying. Mrs. Patterson next door would see her car pull into the driveway around 3 in the afternoon, home just long enough to shower and change clothes before heading to the restaurant for the dinner shift. Mrs. Patterson once asked her if she ever slept, and Catherine had laughed, a real laugh, not a bitter one, and said, "Sleep is a luxury for people with only one job." She said it without self-pity. She said it the way someone might describe a fact about the weather. Marcus was a good boy when he was younger, Mrs. Patterson would later tell police. He was polite. He held the door for her once when I was carrying groceries. But something shifted around age 11, 12. He became quieter. His eyes changed. He'd sit in his room for hours, and the sounds coming from behind that door sounded less like childhood and more like something else, something darker, though Mrs. Patterson couldn't quite articulate what she meant by that. She mentioned it once to Catherine, who smiled and said, "That's just puberty. He'll grow out of it." But Catherine knew, even then, that something wasn't growing out. Something was growing in. By the time Marcus was 13, Catherine had begun receiving regular calls from school The guidance counselor, Mr. Harrison, called with concerns about his grades, his attitude, his seeming lack of interest in anything academic. Teachers reported that he'd made inappropriate comments in class. He'd been caught watching something on his phone that he shouldn't have been watching. He'd been disrespectful to an assistant principal. Each call landed differently on Catherine's shoulders. After work, exhausted, still in her server's uniform, still smelling of grease and coffee. She'd listened to Mr. Harrison explain that Marcus showed signs of what he called entitlement issues and possible conduct concerns, and she'd promised to speak with her son. She'd say the right things. She understood the seriousness. She would address it immediately. She believed that if she just talked to him enough, if she just explained the consequences clearly enough, he would understand. She believed that her love and her words could reach whatever was happening inside him. She was wrong about that. She was profoundly, fatally wrong. But she couldn't have known it until it was too late. Catherine kept photographs on the refrigerator, old ones mostly. Marcus, at 6 years old, holding a goldfish at the county fair, his expression pure wonder. Marcus, at 9, graduating from elementary school, proud in a white shirt that she'd saved for weeks to buy him. Marcus, at 12, already taller than her, caught mid-laugh at a family dinner. These photographs represented the versions of her son that she understood, the ones she could love without confusion. On the night of March 15th, as she stood in that kitchen preparing dinner, pasta, his favorite, she was still operating under the assumption that the boy in those photographs still existed somewhere inside the teenager who now barely spoke to her. She'd confiscated his gaming console that afternoon. He'd been spending too much time in that room, staring at that screen, disconnected from the world and from her. The argument had been brief, almost clinical. He'd yelled. She'd remained calm, using the tone that the parenting blogs recommended. Firm, but loving. Clear consequences. He'd retreated to his room and she'd cooked dinner, believing that eventually he would come out, they would eat together, and things would improve. She was making his favorite meal. How could that not be an olive branch? How could that not be a gesture he would understand as love? The last voicemail Catherine left was on her sister's phone, recorded at 4 in the afternoon. Her sister, Michelle, worked in Colorado and couldn't visit often. The message was brief, casual. Catherine had been thinking about scheduling a family trip to the lake for summer. She wanted to plan ahead. She wanted to give Marcus something to look forward to. Michelle found that voicemail 2 days later, after everything had ended, and she played it over and over, her sister's voice steady and hopeful and alive. "Hey, it's Kath. Just wanted to talk about maybe renting that cabin for a week in July. Marcus is so into photography now. Did I tell you? He's actually interested in something. I think getting him away from that computer might be really good for him. Call me back." Photography. That detail seemed almost cruel in its irony. She'd thought he was developing interest, growing, changing for the better. What she'd actually been observing was the documentation of darker thoughts. His photography interest had been taking pictures of things that should never be photographed, storing them in folders she never knew existed, planning things in the language of a mind that had already decided what it would do. Catherine had also scheduled a meeting at the school. The appointment was written on the calendar that hung by the kitchen phone. School meeting with Mr. Harrison, 10 a.m., March 16th. She'd planned to go in person, to sit down with the guidance counselor and discuss Marcus's behavior, to ask what she could do at home to help. She'd planned to be proactive. She'd planned to save him. The morning never came. March 16th arrived as the day Catherine Henderson stopped breathing, stopped working, stopped hoping, stopped believing that love alone could fix what had broken inside her son. The calendar entry remained on the wall for 3 weeks after her death, a ghost of an appointment that would never be kept, a monument to a mother's hope that had exceeded her son's capacity for gratitude or even basic humanity. She never made it to that meeting. She would never make it anywhere again. March 15th began like any other Tuesday. The neighborhood was ordinary, the houses were modest, the lawns needed spring maintenance. There was nothing in the air that morning, no premonition, no portent, no sign that by evening that quiet suburban street would be transformed into a crime scene. Catherine worked her breakfast shift at Sunrise Diner, serving eggs and coffee to regulars who knew her name and asked about her son. She worked her afternoon shift at the hospital, cleaning rooms and replacing soiled linens. She came home at 4:30 as scheduled. She showered, she changed clothes. She began to prepare dinner. Marcus was in his room, as he'd been since she'd taken the gaming console from his nightstand that afternoon. The confiscation had sparked the argument, not a physical confrontation. Catherine wasn't a striker, wasn't someone who believed in violence as a parenting tool, but her words had been firm. He was spending too much time online. His grades were slipping. His attitude had become intolerable. The console would remain confiscated until his behavior improved. He'd yelled at her with the particular venom that 14-year-olds reserve for adults who refuse to bend to their will. She'd remained calm. She'd returned to the kitchen. She'd begun cooking pasta. The argument seemed to have concluded, as arguments do. It was ordinary. It was routine. It was the last argument they would ever have. For approximately 2 hours, the house settled into silence. Catherine worked in the kitchen. The smell of tomato sauce and garlic filled the small home. The pasta water boiled. She set the table for two, placing napkins beside the plates, believing that food and proximity might bridge whatever distance had grown between her and her son. She likely believed that hunger would eventually draw him from his room, that the smell of his favorite meal would remind him that his mother loved him, that this punishment was temporary, that reconciliation was inevitable. Somewhere around 6:30, Marcus emerged from his room. Catherine was at the stove, her back to the hallway. He didn't speak. He walked past her without acknowledgement. He moved through the kitchen with a purpose that his mother didn't yet recognize. He opened the cabinet beneath the kitchen sink, the cabinet where his mother kept the cleaning supplies and the rarely used items that required storage. He didn't find what he was looking for there. He moved to the hallway closet. His mother might have asked what he was searching for, but she remained focused on the sauce, on the pasta, on the small rituals of motherhood that she believed still mattered. In the closet, hidden behind winter coats and spare blankets, was the safe. It was a small home safe, the kind that holds important documents and small valuables. It was not locked. His mother had never imagined that it would need to be. Inside the safe was a handgun, a 9mm pistol that his father had purchased years earlier before he'd left, and before he'd become the absent figure that Marcus barely remembered. Catherine had kept the gun after the divorce, more out of habit than necessity. She'd never fired it. She'd never even held it in recent memory. She knew it was there. She was aware of its existence the way one is aware of fire extinguishers, theoretical protection against a scenario one cannot imagine actually occurring. Marcus knew it was there because he'd found it months earlier while searching for something else. And he'd said nothing. He'd simply filed the information away. He'd carried it with him through school days and sleep. He'd thought about it while playing video games. He'd thought about it while his mother worked. He'd thought about it while his teachers explained algebra and history and the consequences of poor choices. The gun was cold in his hands, heavier than he'd expected. The weight of it felt significant, though he couldn't have articulated why. He checked to ensure it was loaded. It was. He carried it back toward the kitchen, where his mother stood, still focused on dinner, still believing that the evening could be salvaged. She turned when she heard him. Her expression shifted. Confusion, then alarm. Her mouth opened to form words, to demand an explanation, to reassert the authority of motherhood. But the moment for words had already passed. A single shot was fired, not multiple shots, not the wild panic of someone overwhelmed by emotion. One shot, clinical, deliberate, at close range. The sound was enormous in that small space, an explosion of consequence that would reshape the entire suburb's understanding of what was possible. Catherine fell. There was blood. There was the smell of gunpowder, acrid, chemical, the scent of powder burning inside a metal tube. There was the silence that comes after violence, that strange and terrible quiet that follows the loudest moment of someone's life. There was the kitchen, now a crime scene, though it still looked like a kitchen. Pasta boiling on the stove, sauce simmering, 2 plates set on the table, napkins folded, the television playing somewhere in the background, a commercial for a car or a medication or some product meant to improve someone's life. None of it mattered. All of it was frozen in the moment before everything changed. Marcus stood motionless. He held the gun in his hand. He looked at his mother on the floor. He did not scream. He did not cry. He did not call for help immediately. He did not drop the weapon in shock or horror. Instead, he set the gun down carefully on the counter. He turned off the burner beneath the pasta. He returned to his room. He picked up the gaming controller from his nightstand. He sat on his bed and resumed playing where he'd left off, his character frozen in some digital landscape, waiting for him to return, waiting for him to make the next move. 17 minutes would pass before he called 911. When he finally dialed, his voice was calm. He told the dispatcher that there had been an accident. He said his mother had been shot. He gave the address. He answered the dispatcher's rapid questions with the tone of someone reporting a minor inconvenience. No, he wasn't injured. No, there was no active threat. His mother was in the kitchen. Yes, he was alone. The dispatcher heard something in his voice, something that didn't match the words he was saying, some absence of emotion that created a dissonance in the conversation. She kept him on the line, asking clarifying questions, trying to establish whether he was in danger, or whether his mother was still alive, or whether he was in shock. He answered each question with precision. He was 14 years old. He was breathing normally. He could see his mother from where he sat. No, he didn't know how to perform CPR. No, he didn't want to attempt it. He would simply wait for the ambulance to arrive. The dispatcher documented the call, and even in the transcript, the cold written record of his words, something was fundamentally wrong. Not the words themselves, but the absence of everything that should have accompanied them. Panic, fear, grief, shock. The paramedics would arrive in less than 8 minutes. When they entered the house, they would find a boy sitting on the edge of his bed, controller still in his hands, his mother already beyond saving. Officer James Mitchell had been a police officer for 19 years. In that time, he'd responded to accidents and assaults and domestic disturbances. He'd seen people at their worst. He'd witnessed the aftermath of rage and desperation and human weakness. He thought he understood what the world contained, what violence looked like, what tragedy felt like when you arrived just minutes too late to prevent it. But nothing in his 19 years had prepared him for what he found when he entered 487 Maple Street at 6:47 in the evening. The first thing he noticed was the smell, not the smell of blood specifically. Because officers learn quickly that blood doesn't have a distinctive odor the way people imagine, it was the smell of gunpowder, acrid and chemical, hanging in the air like a ghost of the shot that had been fired. The smell reached him at the front door before he'd even crossed the threshold. It was the smell that told him everything. He knew before he saw anything that this was a shooting. He knew before he saw her that Catherine Henderson was dead. The smell of that moment, that explosion of metal and heat and consequence, had written itself into the air and into his memory forever. The paramedics had arrived first, as they always do. They'd entered the home with their equipment and their training and their desperate hope that they might reverse something irreversible. The boy, Marcus, though Officer Mitchell didn't yet know his name, had simply pointed them toward the kitchen. "She's in there," he'd said, with the tone of someone giving directions to a bathroom. The paramedics found Catherine on the floor near the stove, near the boiling pasta, near the 2 place settings that were still waiting for a meal that would never be eaten. The EMT, named Rodriguez, would later describe the scene with the clinical precision that comes from training. Entry wound consistent with close-range gunshot, catastrophic internal injuries, no signs of life. She was pronounced dead at 6:53, exactly 16 minutes after she'd fallen. The paramedics didn't speak much after that. There was nothing to discuss. There was only the paperwork and the securing of the scene and the beginning of a process that would consume the next 18 months. Officer Mitchell moved through the kitchen with careful steps, documenting everything. The pasta still boiling, the sauce still simmering, the 2 plates still set. The small tableau of normalcy interrupted by a single moment of violence. The boy was sitting on his bed when Officer Mitchell found him. He was still holding the gaming controller. The television was still on, still displaying the game in pause mode, still waiting for the player to resume. Marcus didn't look up when the officer entered. He didn't seem particularly interested in the badge or the uniform or the authority that Officer Mitchell represented. When asked to put down the controller, he did so without argument. When asked his name, he answered. When asked what had happened, he said, "I don't know." His affect was flat. His responses were minimal. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He wasn't displaying any of the physical manifestations of trauma or grief or shock that would be expected from a 14-year-old boy who had just experienced whatever had occurred in that kitchen. Officer Mitchell had seen shock before. He recognized the dissociation that sometimes comes when the mind experiences something it cannot process. But this felt different. This felt less like shock and more like absence, like the boy wasn't present in his own body, or perhaps more accurately, like he'd never been fully present to begin with. The body cam footage would later become crucial evidence. The audio captured every word, every pause, every inflection. Officer Mitchell asked basic questions. Where is the gun? What happened? Why did you call? The boy answered with precision. The gun was on the counter. There had been an accident. He'd called when it seemed appropriate. When Officer Mitchell asked him to explain what happened in greater detail, Marcus described the sequence of events with the tone of someone recounting a homework assignment. His mother had confiscated his gaming console. They'd argued. He'd retrieved the firearm from the closet safe. He'd fired one shot. He'd returned to his room and resumed playing. He'd called 911 after 17 minutes. The narrative was presented without emotion, without justification, without apology. It was presented as fact, as something that had simply occurred, the way one might describe the weather or the time of day. Officer Mitchell's voice on the recording shows visible strain, the realization, moment by moment, that he was not dealing with a traumatized child, but with something else entirely. The boy never asked about his mother's condition. He never expressed concern about whether she was alive or dead or injured. He never asked for a lawyer, never asked for his grandmother, never asked for anything except, eventually, "Can I go now?" The neighbors began to appear on their porches as the police cars multiplied on Maple Street. Mrs. Patterson from next door saw the ambulance arrive and then leave without the urgency that a living patient would demand. She understood, in that moment, that someone had died in that house. She thought of Catherine, who'd always been pleasant, always been exhausted, always been trying. She'd seen the boy, Marcus, though she'd never learned his name, sitting on the curb sometimes with that blank expression, staring at nothing, as if the world around him was too tedious to engage with. She'd mentioned it to her husband once, something off about that kid. Her husband had dismissed it as normal adolescent brooding, but standing on her porch as the evening grew darker and the police presence grew larger, Mrs. Patterson understood that normal adolescent brooding and whatever existed inside that boy were two entirely different things. The paramedics had wheeled a stretcher out of the house, but it wasn't covered. It was empty. That told the neighbors everything. Officer Mitchell stood in the kitchen and looked at the scene one more time. The pasta, the sauce, the plates, the blood. And he understood that he was looking at the last meal that Catherine Henderson had attempted to prepare. She'd been trying to cook her way back to her son's affection. She'd been trying to use food as a language of love. She'd been trying in the way that mothers do, with an optimism that didn't account for the possibility that some people cannot be reached through love, no matter how genuine or desperate that love might be. By the time the forensics team arrived, by the time the photographer began documenting every angle, the pasta had boiled dry. Detective Sarah Wallace arrived at 487 Maple Street at 7:32 in the evening. She was the lead investigator for the county's major crimes unit, and she had spent her entire career learning to read people, to understand the small tells, the inconsistencies, the gaps between what someone claimed had happened and what the physical evidence revealed had actually occurred. She walked through the kitchen and immediately understood that whatever story this case would tell, it would not be the story that a 14-year-old boy was about to provide. The pasta was still there, dried now, hardened on the burner. The sauce had begun to congeal. The 2 plates remained set. But what struck Detective Wallace most was the trajectory. The forensic photographer had already marked the entry wound on the victim's body. The wound was precise. It was directly beneath the left breast, angled slightly upward. It was the wound of someone who knew where to aim, or at least someone who had held the gun at a specific height and distance. It was not the wound of someone shooting wildly in panic or self-defense. It was not the wound of an accident. It was the wound of intent. When she reviewed Officer Mitchell's preliminary interview with Marcus, she noticed something that made her pause. He'd claimed it was an accident. Then, in a secondary statement, he'd suggested self-defense. 2 different narratives, offered hours apart, neither of them matching the physical reality of the scene. Detectives loved when suspects lied. Lies were confessions. Lies demonstrated consciousness of guilt. And this boy had already offered 2 different versions of the same event, which meant he understood on some level that the truth would condemn him. The search warrant for the house was executed at 8:45. Detective Wallace and her team moved through the spaces with methodical precision, documenting everything, bagging everything that might matter. The gun was photographed in place before being secured as evidence. Gunshot residue was collected from Marcus's hands. The safe was examined. The bedroom was photographed. And it was in the bedroom that they found something that changed the trajectory of the investigation entirely. On the walls, on the insides of the closet doors, on surfaces that Marcus had clearly believed were private, there were drawings. Not normal adolescent sketches, not the doodles of a bored student. These were images of violence, stick figures with weapons, houses with targets marked on them, stick figures lying on the ground with X marks across their eyes. There were words scrawled around the images, words that were crude but unmistakable in their meaning. Words about power, words about escaping, words about what would happen if someone tried to control him. One drawing showed a larger figure and a smaller figure, with an arrow pointing from the larger to the smaller, and the word trapped written in capital letters. Another showed a figure at a computer, surrounded by walls, and the phrase, "no one understands," repeated in increasingly jagged handwriting. These were not the drawings of a child acting on impulse. These were the visual record of a mind that had been contemplating violence, fantasizing about it, preparing for it in the way that certain people do before they act. The phone was confiscated at 9:15. It was a relatively new model, secured with a 4-digit code that Marcus provided without hesitation. The device contained the digital history of his thoughts, his searches, his communications. The forensic technician began the process of extracting data, a meticulous procedure that would take weeks to complete, but preliminary searches revealed patterns that were damning. There were searches for how to get away with shooting someone. There were searches for what happens if a minor kills a parent. There were searches for juvenile law and can you be tried as an adult. There were searches for how much time would you get for murder. The searches spanned months. They showed a progression of thought, a deepening of contemplation. At first, the searches seemed exploratory, general questions about consequences and legality. But as the timeline advanced, they became more specific, more focused, more intentional. By February, the searches had narrowed to questions about juvenile sentencing in his specific state. By early March, they'd shifted to questions about evidence destruction and what police look for in crime scenes. He'd been preparing, not in the way that someone prepares for something that might happen, in the way that someone prepares for something they've already decided will happen. The text messages were equally revealing. Marcus had a group chat with 3 friends, boys whose names would later be redacted in the official reports. In that chat, 2 weeks before the shooting, he'd written, "My mum is so annoying. She thinks she can control me." A friend had responded with sympathy, the kind of generic support that adolescents offer each other. "Parents suck," the friend had written. But Marcus had replied with something darker. "Yeah, but mine is different. Mine needs to learn a lesson." The detective reading these messages felt something cold move through her body. That phrase, "needs to learn a lesson," was not the language of frustration. It was the language of intent. There was a voice memo on the phone as well, recorded at 6:58 in the evening, 11 minutes after the shot was fired. Marcus's voice steady and calm, speaking directly to the phone as if recording a log or a diary entry. "It's done. She's on the floor. She can't tell me what to do anymore. I'm free now." The audio lasted 47 seconds. In those seconds, he described what he'd done with the tone of someone accomplishing a task, not celebrating, not traumatized, simply stating fact. The evidence was overwhelming. The case was not complex. A boy had planned to kill his mother. A boy had carried out that plan. A boy had then attempted to construct lies to escape responsibility for his actions. And those lies had failed almost immediately because the evidence spoke louder than words. Detective Wallace met with the prosecutor, Sarah Chen, at 10 o'clock that evening. Chen listened as Wallace outlined what they'd found: the drawings, the searches, the messages, the voice memo. Chen's expression hardened with each piece of information. This was not a case about a child in crisis. This was not a case about mental illness or impulse or tragic accident. This was a case about a boy who had made a decision, a boy who had acted on that decision. a boy who had then attempted to manipulate the system by lying about what he'd done. Chen stood and walked to the window of her office, looking out at the dark street below. "First-degree murder," she said quietly. "Premeditation, deliberation, intent. All of it is there." Wallace nodded. The case would be significant. The public would be outraged. A boy of 14 had murdered his own mother, and he'd done it with a clarity of purpose that should have been impossible at his age. But the evidence didn't care about what should be possible. The evidence simply recorded what had occurred. And what had occurred was undeniable. The first lie had cracked within hours. By morning, they would all be exposed. Dr. Marcus Chen, a different Marcus than the defendant, a detail that would later seem almost ironic, was the forensic psychologist assigned to evaluate the boy. He was 62 years old, with 38 years of experience conducting evaluations in cases exactly like this one. He'd evaluated serial offenders and child abusers and people driven to violence by psychosis and desperation. He prided himself on his ability to understand the pathology beneath criminal behavior, to identify the mental illness or trauma or neurological dysfunction that had contributed to someone's capacity to harm. He approached the evaluation of Marcus Henderson with the same clinical methodology he brought to every case: standardized tests, interview questions, behavioral observation. The boy would be held in juvenile detention pending trial, and the evaluation would become part of the psychological record, evidence that might be used to argue for leniency or to understand what had gone wrong in the development of a 14-year-old's mind. Dr. Chen conducted the initial interview in a small room at the detention facility. Was he with a behavioral specialist present to document the session? He began with basic demographic questions, establishing rapport the way trained psychologists do. How are you feeling? How are you sleeping? Are the staff treating you well? The boy answered each question with appropriate brevity. Fine. Okay. Yes. Nothing in his demeanor suggested distress or discomfort. He seemed, if anything, mildly bored by the process. When Dr. Chen began to explore the boy's understanding of his situation, something became immediately apparent. Marcus didn't demonstrate the denial that sometimes accompanies trauma. He didn't minimize his actions or attempt to construct alternative narratives about what had occurred. Instead, he stated the facts with a precision that bordered on clinical. He had killed his mother. He had done so intentionally. He understood that this was a serious matter, but when asked about his emotional state regarding these facts, his response was remarkably consistent. He felt nothing, not sadness, not regret, not fear about consequences, simply nothing. When Dr. Chen asked him to describe his mother, Marcus used the word annoying multiple times. She was annoying because she tried to control him. She was annoying because she'd taken away his gaming console. She was annoying because she'd called the school and reported his behavioral problems. When asked if he missed her, the question seemed to confuse him. Miss her? Why would he miss someone who'd been restricting his freedom? The absence of grief in his responses was striking. The absence of any acknowledgement that his mother had been a human being with value, with hopes, with a life that extended beyond her relationship to him. This absence was profound and chilling. Dr. Chen had seen callousness before. He'd evaluated people who'd hurt others without hesitation, but most of them demonstrated some level of understanding that what they'd done was wrong, even if they didn't feel appropriately guilty about it. This boy seemed to lack even that intellectual understanding. When Dr. Chen administered the standardized psychological assessments, the results were telling. The boy scored exceptionally high on measures of narcissism, not the casual self-centeredness of typical adolescence, but a pathological elevation that suggested a fundamental distortion in how he perceived himself in relation to others. His empathy scores were notably low. His ability to understand the emotional experiences of other people was significantly below average for his age. When shown images designed to evoke emotional responses, images of people suffering or grieving, his physiological responses were minimal. His pupils didn't dilate, his heart rate didn't increase, his skin didn't produce the minute electrical changes that indicate emotional engagement. It was as if the emotional content of the images simply didn't register with him. Dr. Chen made a note in his report. The subject demonstrates significant deficits in empathic capacity and elevated narcissistic traits consistent with conduct disorder, with callous and unemotional presentations. In other words, the boy lacked something fundamental. The boy was missing the capacity to care about the suffering of others. And when someone lacks that capacity, when someone genuinely cannot understand why hurting others is wrong, they become a particular kind of dangerous. What was perhaps most revealing was the boy's attitude toward the legal process itself. He seemed to view the system as a puzzle to be solved, rather than as genuine consequences to be feared. When Dr. Chen asked him about the possibility of significant prison time, the boy laughed. Not nervously, not defensively. An actual laugh, as if something genuinely amused him. He told one of the detention staff members, apparently with complete sincerity, that he'd be home by Christmas. Christmas, less than 9 months away. He genuinely believed that his age would protect him, that the legal system was constructed in such a way that he would escape serious punishment. He'd constructed an entire narrative in which he was the victim of an unjust situation, trapped by a system that didn't understand him, treated unfairly by adults who couldn't see how reasonable his actions had been. He'd mimicked language that he'd clearly heard elsewhere, phrases about his rights and about due process and about juvenile law, but he seemed to have no genuine understanding of what those phrases meant. He was performing adulthood without possessing any of the emotional or moral development that actual adulthood requires. Dr. Chen found himself disturbed by the evaluation in a way that he rarely allowed himself to be disturbed by his work. He remained professional. He completed the assessment. He wrote his report with clinical precision. But in the privacy of his office, after the evaluation was complete, he sat quietly and thought about what he'd encountered in that room. He'd been evaluating people for decades. He understood that human beings contained multitudes, that violence could emerge from trauma and mental illness and desperation. But he'd rarely encountered someone so young who seemed to be missing the basic architecture of human conscience. The boy wasn't mentally ill in the traditional sense. He wasn't psychotic. He wasn't experiencing hallucinations or delusions that divorced him from reality. He was simply amoral, living in a world where right and wrong were concepts that applied to other people, concepts that didn't constrain his own behavior. Dr. Chen included this in his report. The boy would likely require significant intervention. The boy would likely never develop typical empathic capacity. The boy would likely remain a risk to others for the duration of his life. And the boy, sitting in his detention cell, was absolutely certain that he would be home for Christmas. The arraignment was scheduled for the following Monday, 4 days after Catherine Henderson's death. The courthouse hallways filled early that morning with media personnel and curious onlookers and members of the community who'd heard the news. A boy, 14 years old, accused of murdering his own mother. The specificity of the crime created a particular kind of fascination. Matricide was rare. Matricide by someone so young was rarer still. And matricide by someone who appeared to be acting without remorse was rarer still. The gallery filled with journalists and court observers, and Catherine's family members, her sister Michelle, who'd flown in from Colorado the day of the murder, her parents, her ex-husband, who'd arrived with guilt written across his face because he'd failed to pay attention to what was happening in the home they'd once shared. The judge assigned to the case was Judge Patricia Moore, a woman in her late 50s who'd spent 17 years presiding over juvenile cases. She was known for being fair but firm, for taking seriously the distinction between children who'd made catastrophic mistakes and children who were fundamentally dangerous. She understood that adolescent brains were still developing, that impulse control was incomplete, that judgment was compromised by youth. But she also understood that some people, regardless of their age, demonstrated a clarity of purpose that transcended the standard excuses of adolescence. She'd read the preliminary reports. She'd seen the evidence. She'd reviewed Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation. She was not approaching this case with the assumption that the boy was a frightened child deserving of mercy. Marcus was brought into the courtroom in juvenile detention clothing, orange pants and shirt, his wrists and ankles secured. The courtroom fell silent when he entered. This was the first time the public would see him since his arrest, the first time people would look into the face of a boy accused of such a crime. What they saw was not what most had expected. There was no visible trauma. There was no evidence of distress. There was no body language that suggested shame or fear or the burden of what he'd been accused of. Instead, Marcus walked with his head slightly raised, his expression almost neutral, and then he surveyed the gallery. His eyes moved across the assembled faces, the journalists, the observers, the family members of his victim, and then he smiled. Not a subtle smile, not a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, a genuine, visible smile, as if something about the proceeding genuinely pleased him. Catherine's sister Michelle made a small sound, a gasp or a cry, and her mother reached over to grip her arm. The other observers shifted in their seats. The energy in the room changed. Whatever sympathy might have existed for a frightened teenager evaporated in the face of that smile. The arraignment itself moved quickly. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, outlined the charges: first-degree murder, felony use of a firearm, crimes with clear evidence, and clear intent. The defense attorney, a public defender named Gregory Walsh, who'd been assigned to the case, requested time to review the discovery materials and to prepare an appropriate response. Judge Moore set deadlines. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. The trial would follow after that. Bail was addressed. The prosecutor argued for no bail. The charge was serious, the evidence was strong, and the defendant had demonstrated a concerning lack of remorse. The defense attorney argued for bail, noting the boy's youth, his lack of prior criminal history, his family connections to the community. Judge Moore listened to both arguments with her hands folded on the bench. Then she said, with a clarity that filled the courtroom, "Bail is denied. The defendant will remain in custody pending trial." Marcus's expression didn't change. The smile faded slightly, but there was no panic, no realization that the system was not playing the game the way he'd expected it to play. He simply nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a minor inconvenience. What happened next became the focal point of public outrage. As the bailiff moved to return Marcus to custody, as the proceedings wound toward their conclusion, Marcus looked directly at the gallery one more time, and he shrugged. Not aggressively, not defiantly. A simple, casual shrug. The kind of gesture a person might make in response to a minor frustration. The shrug seemed to communicate something close to, "This doesn't matter. None of this matters. I don't care." Catherine's sister stood up at that moment. She didn't scream. She didn't rush toward him. But her movement was sudden enough that security moved toward her. Her mother pulled her back down. Michelle's face had transformed from shock to something raw. Rage, perhaps, or the particular anguish of watching the murderer of someone you love demonstrate absolute indifference to what he'd done. Judge Moore's expression hardened. She spoke directly to Marcus before he was led away. "I want you to understand something. This is not a game. A woman is dead because of your actions. The seriousness of these proceedings, the weight of what you've been accused of, these are not subjects for casual dismissal. You will treat this courtroom with respect, or you will face additional charges for contempt. Do you understand me?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the words sounded practiced, like something he'd heard on television. The tone didn't match the words. The tone was empty. The bailiff led him away. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. The journalists began texting updates. The cameras outside the courthouse would capture Catherine's family leaving, their faces destroyed by a grief that was now compounded by rage at the boy's behavior. The gallery emptied slowly. People discussed what they'd witnessed. They discussed the smile. They discussed the shrug. They discussed what it meant about a 14-year-old that he could smile while being accused of murdering his own mother. Judge Moore remained on the bench for a moment after the courtroom emptied, reviewing her notes from the proceeding. She'd presided over many cases. She understood adolescence. She understood rage and poor judgment and the ways that young people could make terrible mistakes. But she also understood that some people were simply dangerous, and age was not a meaningful limitation on that danger. The arraignment had taken 42 minutes. In that time, a narrative had begun to form, not in the courtroom, but in the community, in the media, in the minds of people who would follow this case to its conclusion. They would see Marcus not as a child who'd made a tragic error, but as a boy who'd become a symbol of something darker. Entitlement without conscience, privilege without gratitude, arrogance without accountability. The forensic analysis of Marcus's phone took 6 weeks to complete. Detective Wallace worked with a specialized digital forensics team, a unit that existed in the intersection between law enforcement and computer science. They extracted data from the device's storage, from the cloud backups, from the deleted files that most people believed disappeared when they emptied their trash. Digital information doesn't truly vanish. It leaves traces. It leaves ghost images of itself in the spaces between functional data. It leaves a permanent record of what someone has thought, searched for, communicated about. And Marcus's phone contained a chronicle of his deterioration, or perhaps more accurately, a chronicle of the clarification of his intentions. The first searches appeared in the data logs from late November of the previous year, 6 months before he killed his mother. The searches were generic. What happens if you kill someone? And what are the consequences for teenagers who commit crimes? They were exploratory. They suggested curiosity rather than planning. But they also suggested that the thought had already taken root in his mind. Most 14-year-old boys don't search for information about killing people. Most adolescents don't contemplate these scenarios. The fact that he was searching suggested that he was already thinking about it. By December, the searches had become more specific. He'd moved from generic questions about consequences to state-specific information about juvenile law. He searched for, can a 14-year-old be charged as an adult? And what is the minimum sentence for murder in state name? And do minors get lesser sentences for murder? The pattern showed a progression from intellectual curiosity to something more intentional, a gathering of information about what would happen if he committed a crime, about what the system would do to him, and about whether his age would protect him. The searches also revealed something darker. He'd searched for how to delete search history, how to clear browser cache, and can police recover deleted messages. He was learning not just what would happen if he killed someone, but how to attempt to cover his tracks afterward. He was educating himself about evidence destruction. He was thinking about what a crime scene would look like, what investigators would search for, what he might need to do to minimize his exposure to consequences. This was not the behavior of someone contemplating an abstract scenario. This was the behavior of someone planning. The text messages painted an even clearer picture. In a group chat with 3 friends, Marcus had discussed his home situation with increasing bitterness. In early January, and he'd written, "My mum is such a control freak. She doesn't understand that I'm basically an adult." One friend had responded with typical adolescent commiseration. "Parents are the worst." But Marcus's follow-up was different. "Yeah, but mine actually needs to suffer consequences for what she's doing to me." The language was revealing. Not anger, not frustration. The language of someone who believed he had the right to administer punishment to someone who'd wronged him. In February, he'd told his friends that his mother had grounded him and confiscated his gaming console. His response in the group chat was cold. "She's going to regret that decision. She's going to learn what it means to disrespect me." The friends had offered standard sympathy. Marcus had offered something else. Certainty. Absolute certainty that something was going to happen, that his mother was going to suffer, that he was going to make sure of it. The voice memos were perhaps the most damning evidence. Marcus had apparently used the memo app on his phone to record thoughts, to document his grievances, to create what amounted to a psychological record of his own deterioration. In one memo from mid-February, approximately 5 weeks before the murder, he'd recorded himself speaking about his mother for nearly 3 minutes. "She thinks she can control me." His voice came through the speaker in the forensics lab, steady and focused. "She doesn't understand that I'm smarter than her. I'm smarter than all of them. They're trying to keep me down, trying to prevent me from doing what I want to do. But there's only so much a person can take, only so much disrespect I'm going to accept. She's going to find out what happens when she pushes someone too far." The words were chilling, but it was the tone that was most disturbing. There was no rage in his voice, no desperation, no emotion at all. Simply a matter-of-fact recitation of what he'd already decided would occur. The forensic analyst playing the audio for Detective Wallace had paused the playback and said quietly, "Listen to how calm he is. He's not expressing anger. He's not venting. He's narrating something he's already decided to do." The console chat logs were equally revealing. Marcus played online multiplayer games, and those games had chat functions where he communicated with other players. In the weeks before the murder, his chat messages had become darker. He'd discussed his home situation with people he'd never met, with usernames instead of real names. "My mum thinks she can control me," he'd written. "She's going to learn what happens when you push someone." Another player had responded with something like, "Parents suck." But Marcus's response was different. "Yeah, but mine is going to pay for it." The ambiguity was intentional. The threat was veiled enough that it could be dismissed as teenage venting, but it was also clear enough that it communicated his intentions to anyone paying attention. And most people weren't paying attention. Most people read complaints about parents and dismissed them as normal adolescent frustration. Most people didn't recognize the particular quality of his language, the certainty, the finality, the absence of anything approaching doubt. But the evidence that would ultimately prove most devastating was the video. On his phone, in a folder labeled simply personal, investigators found a short video clip recorded at 6:58 in the evening on March 15th. 6:58, 11 minutes after the gunshot. The video showed Marcus's face, filmed from above, his expression calm. He was lying on his bed. The video lasted 47 seconds. In it, he spoke directly to the camera. "She tried to control me. She tried to make me into something I'm not. But I showed her what happens when you disrespect me. I showed her that I'm not someone who can be pushed around. She's on the floor right now. She's not going to tell me what to do anymore. I'm free now. I'm finally free." The video was calm. The language was matter of fact. He was documenting his own crime as if recording a journal entry, as if this was something he'd planned to remember, to preserve, to perhaps even share. The digital forensics team copied the video, preserved it, and handed it over to the prosecution. When Detective Wallace watched it, she felt something cold move through her body. This wasn't a boy acting in the heat of passion. This wasn't a moment of adolescent rage. This was premeditation and execution. This was consciousness of guilt. This was a permanent record of a boy's complete absence of remorse. The pre-trial hearing was scheduled for 4 weeks into the legal process. By that point, media coverage of the case had intensified significantly. The story had captured the public imagination in a way that most cases don't. A 14-year-old boy who'd murdered his own mother. A boy who'd smiled during his arraignment. A boy who seemed to possess no capacity for remorse or shame. The narrative had been constructed by the media, by social media, by the thousands of comments from people who'd never met Marcus or Catherine, but who felt compelled to weigh in on what the outcome should be. Online petitions had been circulated demanding that the boy be tried as an adult. Conservative commentators had used the case to argue about juvenile justice reform. Progressive commentators had argued that the case represented a systemic failure to identify and treat mentally disturbed children. Everyone had opinions. Everyone had theories. Everyone seemed to have forgotten that at the center of all of this was a dead woman and a boy who'd put her there. The pre-trial hearing itself was relatively routine, a procedural checkpoint to ensure that discovery materials had been exchanged, that both sides were prepared for trial, that evidence was being handled appropriately. But routine proceedings can become explosive when the defendant decides that decorum is irrelevant. Marcus was brought into the courtroom in the same orange detention clothing. He'd been in custody for the entire month, housed in a juvenile detention facility 50 miles outside the city. The time in detention hadn't softened him. If anything, he seemed more confident, as if the month had simply reinforced his belief that he could navigate any system, that he possessed some fundamental advantage that would allow him to escape serious consequences. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, was presenting the results of the forensic analysis to Judge Moore. She described the phone evidence methodically, the searches, the text messages, the voice memos, the video. She described how the evidence painted a picture not of a moment of passion, but of months of planning, of escalating intent, of a boy who'd systematically educated himself about what would happen if he committed murder and had decided that whatever consequences existed were acceptable. She was describing the video clip when something changed in the courtroom. Marcus laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not a nervous laugh. An actual, audible laugh. A sound of genuine amusement that rippled through the gallery and caused heads to turn. Judge Moore's eyes fixed on him immediately. "Is something amusing, Mr. Henderson?" Her voice was sharp. There was no warmth in it, as no attempt to understand or excuse. Marcus's smile faded slightly, but he didn't appear chastened. He simply shrugged. "No, Mom," he said. But the laugh had happened. The gallery had heard it. And in that moment, something shifted in how people understood this case. This wasn't a frightened boy trying to navigate a system he didn't understand. This was a boy who found the entire proceeding, the evidence against him, the description of his mother's death, the gravity of what he'd been accused of, genuinely funny. The prosecutor continued, but her momentum had been disrupted. The gallery was no longer simply listening to evidence. They were watching a boy who appeared to be mocking the proceedings, mocking the seriousness of what had happened, mocking the memory of his dead mother. Catherine's sister stood up, not to leave, not to cause a scene, simply to stand, to make her presence visible, to communicate wordlessly that she was watching him, that his behavior was being witnessed. Security moved toward her to ensure she remained under control, but Judge Moore waved them back. "Let her stand," the judge said quietly. The defense attorney, Gregory Walsh, attempted to regain control of the narrative. He argued, as he'd been arguing since the beginning, that Marcus was a child, 14. The brain at 14 was still developing. The capacity for impulse control was incomplete. The ability to understand long-term consequences was compromised by age. These were not excuses, Walsh said, but realities that must be considered. He argued for the possibility of rehabilitation, for the existence of programs that had successfully intervened with troubled adolescents, and for the potential that his client could eventually become a functioning member of society. It was a competent argument. It was the argument that had to be made, but it lacked force in the face of what the gallery had just witnessed. A boy laughing while hearing about the death he'd caused. The prosecutor, when given the opportunity for rebuttal, simply stood and said, "The evidence speaks for itself. The defendant's behavior in this courtroom today speaks for itself. We're not dealing with a child in crisis. We're dealing with someone who understands exactly what he did and doesn't care." She said nothing more. Sometimes silence is more powerful than words. It was at this moment that Judge Moore made a decision that would significantly impact the trajectory of the trial. She looked directly at Marcus and said, "The video evidence will be played in its entirety during trial, not just excerpts, the complete 47 seconds. The jury will hear every word your voice recorded after your mother fell." Marcus's expression changed. For the first time since the proceeding began, something flickered across his face. Not fear exactly, but a recognition that his control over the narrative was limited. The video was damaging. He'd known that. He'd had to know that. But seeing it in his future, unavoidable and complete, seemed to penetrate the armor of his confidence slightly. The hearing concluded shortly after. As Marcus was being led from the courtroom, his demeanor had shifted marginally. The smirk was gone. The confidence was less visible. He was still in control of his expression, still refusing to give the gallery the satisfaction of visible fear. But something had cracked. The mask of invulnerability had developed a visible fracture. Catherine's sister watched him leave, and for the first time since his arrest, she felt something other than pure rage. She felt hope that the system might actually work, that evidence and truth might be powerful enough to overcome whatever advantages wealth or age or privilege might provide. The trial began on a Monday in May, 7 weeks after Catherine Henderson's death. The courtroom was packed. Media had obtained seats through the lottery system designed to manage overflow. Spectators lined the hallway outside, hoping for a glimpse of the proceedings. The community was invested in this case in a way that transcended normal curiosity. It represented something larger than a single crime. It represented a failure of systems to protect someone vulnerable, a failure of warning signs to be recognized and acted upon, a failure of a mother's love to be enough to save her own child from himself. The judge had issued strict orders about media conduct and public behavior, but the gallery was electric with tension. Catherine's family sat in the front row. Her sister Michelle, her parents, her ex-husband. They had chosen to be present for all of it, to witness the evidence of what their family member had endured, to ensure that her death was not treated as an abstraction or a case file number. Marcus sat at the defense table, dressed now in civilian clothing rather than detention wear. The decision to clothe him in normal teenage attire was strategic, the defense wanting the jury to see a young person rather than someone branded as a criminal. But the strategy seemed to backfire. He looked ordinary. He looked like someone you'd pass in a hallway, and that ordinariness, in the context of what he'd allegedly done, made him seem more dangerous rather than less. The prosecutor, Sarah Chen, began her opening statement by walking the jury through the morning of March 15th. She described Catherine's routine: early alarm, packed lunch for her son, 2 jobs to provide for them both. She described a mother's ordinary love, the kind that asks nothing in return, except that the child will grow up and become a decent person. Then she described the evening, the argument over the gaming console, the escalation, the retreat, the return with the gun. She walked the jury through the sequence of events with a precision that allowed them to visualize it, to place themselves in that kitchen, to understand the moment before the shot was fired. The jury, 12 people, 6 men and 6 women, ranging in age from 24 to 67, listened with visible attention. Some took notes. Some stared at Marcus. Some stared at the jury instructions, avoiding the defendant's face entirely. When Chen described the single shot, when she described Catherine falling, when she described Marcus sitting down and resuming his gaming, the courtroom was completely silent. There was no coughing, no shifting of papers, no background noise except for Chen's voice. She had the jury's absolute attention. And then she said something that would become the central truth of the case. This was not an accident. This was not a moment of teenage rage. This was execution. The first witness called was Dr. Richard Paulson, the medical examiner. He took the stand with the bearing of someone accustomed to being in courtrooms, accustomed to describing death in clinical terms for the benefit of juries who needed to understand what violence looked like when examined systematically. He described the entry wound with precise language, the location approximately beneath the left breast, the angle slightly upward, suggesting the gun had been held at chest level or slightly below, the depth of penetration, the trajectory through vital organs. He explained that the victim had died from massive internal bleeding. That death would have been relatively rapid, perhaps minutes rather than hours, but long enough that she would have experienced the reality of what had happened. He described the absence of any defensive wounds, no scratches on her hands, no evidence that she'd attempted to defend herself, no indication that she'd known what was about to happen. She'd simply turned when she heard him enter the kitchen, and then she'd been shot. The cross-examination by the defense was brief and accomplished little. The physical facts were the physical facts. There was no alternate interpretation of them. The next witness was the forensic pathologist who'd performed the detailed ballistics analysis. Using photographs and diagrams, He walked the jury through the trajectory of the bullet. He explained how the angle of entry, combined with the location of the victim, could establish the approximate height and distance from which the gun had been fired. He demonstrated, using a diagram of the kitchen, that the shot could only have been fired from someone standing at a particular location, at a particular distance, at a particular angle. And that location, that distance, that angle, all of it corresponded with Marcus being the shooter. All of it was consistent with deliberate aim rather than accident or panic. The defense attorney asked if it was possible that someone else had fired the shot, if the trajectory could have accommodated a different shooter. The forensic pathologist considered the question carefully, then said, "Theoretically, it's possible that someone slightly taller or shorter than the defendant could have fired the shot. But the evidence is consistent with the defendant being the shooter, and there's no evidence of anyone else being present in the home at the time." The diagram remained on the screen in front of the jury, Catherine's body marked with a red line, showing the path of the bullet, the physics of violence rendered in simple geometry. The next piece of evidence was the gunshot residue. A forensic analyst testified that residue had been collected from Marcus's hands within hours of the shooting. Gunshot residue, tiny particles of metals and chemicals that are released when a gun is fired, doesn't remain on someone's hands for very long. It can be washed away. It can be rubbed away. It can be lost simply through the passage of time and the normal movements of hands. The fact that residue was still present on Marcus's hands hours after the shooting meant that he had fired the gun and had not subsequently engaged in activities that would have removed the residue. The presence of residue was the physical evidence of his guilt written on his skin. When Chen presented photographs of the residue collection, when she showed the jury the physical evidence of his hands being tested, the significance seemed to land differently than it had during the pre-trial hearing. This wasn't abstract forensic analysis anymore. This was proof. This was the moment when the investigation had caught him, when his hands had betrayed him, when the physics of violence had written his guilt on his body in a language that the jury could understand. The defense offered no meaningful challenge to the residue evidence. There was nothing to challenge. He had fired the gun. The evidence was unambiguous. The prosecution had saved the most damaging evidence for the middle of the trial, after the physical evidence had been established, but before closing arguments would synthesize everything into a coherent narrative of guilt. The most damaging evidence was Marcus's own voice, his own words, his own documentation of his own crime. The audio technician played the voice memo that had been recorded 5 weeks before the murder, the one where Marcus had spoken about his mother with the casual certainty of someone describing a future that had already been decided. The courtroom was silent as his voice came through the speakers. "She thinks she can control me. She doesn't understand that I'm smarter than her. I'm smarter than all of them." The teenage voice, clear and focused, filled the space. "They're trying to keep me down, trying to prevent me from doing what I want to do. But there's only so much a person can take, only so much disrespect I'm going to accept. She's going to find out what happens when she pushes someone too far." The memo ended. The courtroom absorbed what they'd heard. Catherine's sister closed her eyes. Her mother reached over and gripped her hand. The jury stared at the speaker as if the voice might emerge again, might clarify something, might offer context that would make it less damning. But no clarification came. The prosecutor then played the text messages from the group chat. These were read aloud by the forensic analyst rather than played as audio. But the impact was equally significant. The messages were projected on a screen so that the jury could read them while hearing them spoken. My mum is such a control freak. She doesn't understand that I'm basically an adult. My mum is going to regret that decision. She's going to learn what it means to disrespect me. The messages weren't written in elaborate language. They weren't articulate or sophisticated. They were the crude expressions of a teenage mind, but they were also expressions of intent. They were documentation of his decision to punish his mother, to make her suffer, to teach her a lesson. One message, sent approximately 3 weeks before the murder, read, "She's going to pay for it. I'm going to show her what happens when she tries to control me." The prosecutor paused after this message and asked the forensic analyst, "What does pay for it mean?" The analyst said, "The context suggests a threat of violence or harm." It was an understatement. The context suggested exactly what it said it suggested, that Marcus intended to hurt his mother, and he was communicating this intention to his friends while believing that his words were secure, that no one would ever see them, that he was simply venting and not creating a permanent record of his premeditation. The most devastating piece of digital evidence was played next, the video. The 47 seconds that Marcus had recorded at 6:58 in the evening, 11 minutes after he'd fired the gun. The prosecutor had given the jury a warning before playing it. What you're about to see and hear is the defendant's own documentation of the crime, his own words, recorded immediately after the victim fell. This is the defendant speaking in his own voice, describing what he has just done. The lights in the courtroom dimmed slightly. The screen lit up. Marcus's face appeared, filmed from above, his expression calm. He was lying on his bed. The jury leaned forward. This was evidence in its purest form, not interpretation, not analysis, but the defendant himself speaking directly to them. "She tried to control me," his voice came through the speakers. "She tried to make me into something I'm not. But I showed her what happens when you disrespect me. I showed her that I'm not someone who can be pushed around. She's on the floor right now. She's not going to tell me what to do anymore. I'm free now. I'm finally free." The video ended. The screen went black. The courtroom remained silent. Several things happened simultaneously. Catherine's sister began to cry, not quietly, but with the full-bodied sobs of someone whose grief had been freshly reopened by hearing her nephew's voice, by seeing him smile while describing his mother's death. Her father put his arm around her. One juror, a woman in her 50s, looked away from the screen and stared at her lap. Another juror, an older man, closed his eyes and didn't open them for nearly a minute. Marcus himself remained motionless. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at his attorney. He stared straight ahead at the wall behind the judge's bench. But something in his demeanor had changed. The confidence was gone. The slight smile that had been present at the beginning of the trial had evaporated. He understood, finally. what was happening. The evidence against him was not circumstantial. It was not subject to interpretation. It was his own voice, his own face, his own words documenting his guilt. His attorney, Gregory Walsh, looked like a man who just watched something irretrievable slip through his fingers. The defense of a 14-year-old boy with developmental differences and impulse control problems seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of 47 seconds of video evidence showing the defendant calmly celebrating his mother's death. The prosecutor then presented the console chat logs. These were messages that Marcus had sent to people he'd never met in video game chats, where he'd discussed his mother with strangers. The messages were projected on the screen. "My mom thinks she can control me. She's going to learn what happens when you push someone too far. She's going to pay for it. I'm going to show her." The prosecutor asked the digital forensics analyst, "Is there any ambiguity about what these messages mean?" The analyst answered, "No. The defendant is clearly expressing an intention to harm or punish his mother." The prosecutor paused and asked one final question. "And did the defendant subsequently carry out that intention?" The analyst said simply, "Yes." The testimony ended. The evidence had been presented. The jury had heard the defendant's own voice, seen his own face, read his own words, all of it pointing to the same conclusion. He had planned to hurt his mother. He had hurt his mother. He had then documented the fact that he'd hurt her, without remorse, without regret, simply as documentation of an accomplished task. During the break before the afternoon session resumed, Marcus was taken back to the holding cell. His demeanor had completely shifted. The boy who'd smiled during his arraignment, the boy who'd laughed during the pre-trial hearing, that boy seemed to have disappeared. In his place was a younger, smaller-looking person, a person who was finally beginning to understand that the system was not something he could navigate or manipulate, that his age was not a shield, that his words had convicted him more thoroughly than any physical evidence could have done. The jury had heard him confess in his own voice. They had seen him smile while discussing his mother's death. And no cross-examination, no argument about adolescent development, and no compassionate plea from the defense could undo what they'd experienced. The truth, once spoken in one's own voice, cannot be unspoken. The defense presented its case on Wednesday morning. It was a brief presentation. There was no viable defense for what Marcus had done, no alternate narrative that could coexist with the video evidence, no way to argue that he hadn't known what he was doing or hadn't intended to do it. The defense strategy had shifted to focusing on mitigation, on emphasizing his age, on presenting evidence from a psychologist about his developmental stage, on arguing that even though he'd committed this crime, the system should consider rehabilitation rather than pure punishment. It was competent advocacy. It was what any attorney would be obligated to do, but it carried the weight of futility. The jury had heard Marcus's own voice. They had seen his face. No argument about adolescent brain development could undo the clarity of his premeditation. The defense called a developmental psychologist who testified that at 14, Marcus was still developing the parts of his brain responsible for long-term consequence evaluation. This was true. This was scientifically accurate. But it felt irrelevant in light of the evidence that Marcus had spent months searching for information about consequences, that he'd deliberately gathered knowledge about what would happen if he committed murder, that he'd systematically educated himself about how to attempt to cover his tracks. Knowledge about consequences seemed a different matter from understanding consequences. On Thursday morning, after the defense had rested, Judge Patricia Moore called both attorneys to approach the bench. The jury was sent out. Whatever was about to happen would happen without them present. Once they were gone, Judge Moore looked directly at Marcus and said, "Mr. Henderson, I want to speak with you directly. I want you to understand something fundamental about these proceedings." Her voice was steady, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something harder, contempt perhaps, or the particular kind of anger that comes from witnessing arrogance in the face of irrefutable guilt. "You have smiled in my courtroom. You have laughed while evidence was presented about the death of your mother. You have conducted yourself as if these proceedings are beneath you, as if the gravity of what you've been accused of doesn't matter. I want you to understand that your age does not erase your intent. Your youth does not erase your premeditation. The fact that your brain is still developing does not erase the fact that you spent months planning what you ultimately did." Marcus stared at the judge, and for the first time since the trial began, something shifted in his expression. His confident smirk was gone. His eyes seemed to search for something, an escape route perhaps, or some legal loophole, or some way to minimize the weight of what was being said to him. There was nothing there. Judge Moore continued, "You created a record of your thoughts. You documented your intentions. You made a video recording after your mother fell. And in that video, you smiled. You expressed freedom. You expressed no remorse. These were not the actions of a child acting in panic or moment of rage. These were the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and felt justified in doing it. And that is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case. Not that you committed this crime, but that you seem genuinely incapable of understanding why it was wrong." The judge paused. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of truth being spoken in a place where truth mattered. It was the silence of authority finally making itself felt. "You mistook mercy for weakness," Judge Moore said, and those words seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You believed that the system's commitment to treating juveniles with some measure of compassion meant that you could manipulate that system, that you could escape consequences, that your age was a legal shield. But mercy is not the absence of accountability. Mercy is not the refusal to hold someone responsible for their actions. You are going to learn over the course of the next decades what actual consequences look like." Marcus's jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting on the defense table, clenched into fists. For the first time, he looked small. For the first time, he looked his actual age rather than looking like someone trying to perform an adulthood he didn't possess. The judge's words had penetrated in a way that physical evidence hadn't, in a way that his own recorded voice hadn't. Someone with authority had named what he was, had refused to accept his narrative, had made clear that the system would not bend to his will. Judge Moore then addressed the attorneys. The trial would conclude with closing arguments tomorrow. The jury would deliberate. Whatever verdict they reached, whatever sentence they recommended, the judge wanted to be clear about one thing. This case demonstrated the dangers of allowing entitlement to fester, of allowing a child to become convinced that the normal rules of human decency did not apply to him. If we fail to hold young people accountable for their actions, the judge said, looking between the prosecutor and the defense attorney, we do them no favor. We do society no favor. We fail on every level. The conversation ended. The jury was brought back in. The judge did not explain to them what she'd said to Marcus, but everyone in the courtroom understood that something had shifted. The judge had taken control of the narrative. The room belonged to her now, and not to Marcus, not to his defense, not to any strategy designed to minimize what he'd done. The room belonged to an authority that had finally lost patience with a boy's arrogance. The jury returned to the courthouse on Friday afternoon at 3:14. It was a faster deliberation than many had expected. The case was complex emotionally, but not complex factually. The evidence was clear. The defendant had documented his own guilt. The jury had deliberated for approximately 4 hours across 2 days, long enough to discuss what they'd seen and heard, short enough to suggest that there was no meaningful disagreement among them. The courtroom filled quickly. News of the jury's return had been announced, and media personnel rushed to secure their seats. Catherine's family filed in. Her sister, her parents, her ex-husband. They held hands. They'd been waiting for this moment for 3 months. They'd sat through the trial. They'd heard the evidence. They'd witnessed Marcus's arrogance and his eventual panic. But nothing was certain until the verdict was read. The jury could surprise. The jury could be moved by the defense's arguments about youth and development. The jury could decide that despite the evidence, despite the video, despite the words, rehabilitation was possible and punishment should be measured. Anything was possible until the verdict was spoken aloud. Marcus was brought into the courtroom. He was no longer the confident teenager who'd smiled during his arraignment. The past weeks had eroded something in him. The video evidence, his own recorded voice, the judge's direct confrontation, all of it had accumulated. He looked smaller now. His orange detention shirt seemed to hang differently on him. His face had lost the casual arrogance and had developed the haunted expression of someone who'd finally begun to understand what was happening. His attorney sat beside him, but there was no conversation between them. There was nothing left to say. The bailiff called for the jury. The 12 jurors filed back in, 6 men and 6 women, their expressions carefully neutral, their body language suggesting they'd reached a decision they were confident in. The jury foreman, a woman in her 60s with grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to, took her seat. Judge Moore entered last. She nodded to the bailiff, who asked the jury foreman to stand and announce the verdict. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Moore asked. The jury foreman said, "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff took the verdict form and handed it to the judge. Judge Moore read it without changing her expression. She handed it back to the bailiff, who handed it back to the jury foreman, who read the verdict aloud. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom. It seemed to hang in the air for longer than a single word should hang. Catherine's sister made a small sound, not a cry exactly, but an exhalation that contained relief and rage and grief all at once. Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She simply nodded, as if she'd been proved right about something fundamental. The ex-husband stared straight ahead. The word had been spoken. The truth had been affirmed by a jury of Marcus's peers. He was guilty. Not probably guilty. Not possibly guilty. Guilty. The finality of it seemed to reach Marcus in that moment. His face changed. The last vestiges of his confident demeanor collapsed. He looked down at the table. His attorney touched his arm, but Marcus didn't seem to feel it. He was staring at nothing, processing the reality that the system had not bent to him, that his age had not protected him, that the verdict was exactly what the evidence had always promised it would be. The judge asked if there were any other charges, and the prosecution confirmed there was one additional charge of felony use of a firearm. The jury foreman read the verdict on that charge. Guilty. 2 guilty verdicts, 2 affirmations of guilt. The finality was crushing. There was no possibility of appeal to a higher authority, no chance for a mistrial, no legal escape route remaining. He had been found guilty in a court of law, and that finding would stand unless the evidence was somehow discredited or new evidence emerged that changed the fundamental facts of the case. Neither of those things would happen. The judge asked if the jury had any recommendations regarding sentencing, and they indicated that they had. In juvenile cases, juries often recommended sentencing parameters. The jury foreman handed another form to the judge. Judge Moore read it, and her expression hardened slightly, a sign that the jury's recommendation was likely severe. She didn't announce the recommendation immediately. That would come during the sentencing hearing. For now, the verdict stood. Guilty on all counts. The trial phase of the case was concluded. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks hence. It was time enough for the pre-sentence investigation to be completed, for victim impact statements to be prepared, for the defense to mount whatever mitigation arguments they felt necessary. But 2 weeks was also short enough that Marcus would understand that his conviction was not some distant abstraction. It was immediate. It was real. It was leading toward consequences that would define the rest of his life. As the bailiff moved to take Marcus back into custody, Marcus stood. He looked toward the gallery one final time. His grandmother, his mother's parents, his mother's sister, they all stared back at him. There was no sympathy in their faces. There was only the hard understanding that he had taken someone they loved and had done it deliberately, had documented it, and had shown no remorse. He looked away. He was led out of the courtroom, and as he passed through the door, the finality of it seemed to settle over everyone present. He had been judged. He had been found guilty. Now he would learn what that meant. The sentencing hearing took place on a Friday afternoon in late May, exactly 2 months and 2 days after Catherine Henderson died. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been during the trial. Spectators understood that this was the final chapter, the moment when a judge would determine what Marcus's life would look like for the foreseeable future. Whether he would spend decades behind bars or whether some pathway to eventual release remained open. The media presence was substantial. This was a high-profile case and a significant moment in the community's reckoning with what it meant that one of its own had murdered his mother. Marcus was brought in wearing the same orange detention clothing. He'd lost weight in the 2 weeks since his conviction. The confidence that had characterized him during the arraignment and the early trial phase was completely gone. What remained was a diminished version of the boy, smaller, quieter, older, in some indefinable way that comes from understanding that one's childhood is definitively over. Judge Patricia Moore entered the courtroom and everyone stood. She took her seat and surveyed the gallery before turning her attention to the defendant. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice carrying through the absolute silence of the room, "you have been found guilty of first-degree murder and felony use of a firearm. Before I impose sentence, I want to explain to you and to everyone present why this case matters, why your actions have consequences that extend far beyond your own life, and why the sentence I'm about to deliver reflects the seriousness of what you've done." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. A mother is a particular kind of vulnerable. A mother depends on the trust of her child. She believes, fundamentally, and without question, that her child will not harm her. This is not naive. This is the foundation upon which family structures are built. Catherine Henderson lived by this belief. She worked 2 jobs to provide for you. She sacrificed her own comfort, her own rest, her own dreams for your future. And you chose to interpret this sacrifice as control. You chose to interpret her boundaries as disrespect. You chose to transform her love into something you believed warranted punishment. The judge leaned forward slightly. "I want to describe who Catherine Henderson was, because in cases like this, the victim can become abstract. She can become simply the person who was killed, a footnote to the story of the killer. But she was not abstract. She was specific. She was human. She was a woman who'd worked in hospitals, cleaning patient rooms while her body ached. She was a woman who'd worked in restaurants, serving food and smiling at strangers even when she was exhausted. She was a woman who loved you completely, who believed in you absolutely, who would have given her life for you, and instead you took hers." Catherine's sister began to cry silently. Catherine's mother gripped the edge of the bench in front of her, her knuckles white. The words were not just being heard, they were being experienced as affirmation, as acknowledgement, as a public statement that Catherine's life had mattered. The evidence in this case showed no moment of passion, Judge Moore continued, no moment of teenage rage that spiraled out of control. What the evidence showed was premeditation. What the evidence showed was deliberation. You spent months contemplating what you would do. You spent months gathering information about what would happen to you if you did it. You spent months documenting your grievances and your intentions. And then you acted. You acted with knowledge. You acted with purpose. You acted knowing the consequences and believing, incorrectly, that your age would protect you from experiencing those consequences. But you are not protected. Age does not shield you from the moral weight of your actions. Age does not erase intent. Age does not eliminate guilt. The judge paused and looked directly at Marcus. You will spend the rest of your adolescence in a secure facility. You will spend your young adulthood in a secure facility. You will spend your middle years in a secure facility. You will spend decades of your life behind walls, separated from freedom, from normal human development, from the world you believed you were destined to dominate. And you will have time, extensive time, to contemplate whether the gaming console, whether the freedom from your mother's boundaries, whether whatever you believed you would gain was worth the loss of your own life to incarceration. Marcus's face had gone pale. His hands gripped the edge of the defense table. The judge continued without hesitation. The law in this state permits the consideration of transfer to adult sentencing frameworks in cases of serious felonies committed by juveniles. I am exercising that authority. You will be sentenced under adult sentencing guidelines. You will receive a sentence that reflects the severity of your crime and the absence of any credible evidence of remorse or rehabilitation. The sentence of this court is as follows, Judge Moore said, and the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. On the charge of first-degree murder, you are sentenced to 35 years without the possibility of parole. On the charge of felony use of a firearm, you are sentenced to an additional 5 years to be served consecutively. These sentences are concurrent to each other, but total 40 years of incarceration. You will be eligible for parole review at age 54. You may not be eligible for release even at that time, as that determination will rest with the parole board based on evidence of rehabilitation that you have not demonstrated and that I have no confidence you will demonstrate. She picked up her gavel. Furthermore, you will pay restitution to the victim's family in an amount to be determined. You will provide a formal written apology to the victim's family, and that apology will be genuine, or it will not be accepted. This court has spoken. The gavel came down, not with excessive force, but with finality. The sound of it echoed through the courtroom like a period at the end of a sentence, like the closing of a door that would not reopen. 2 weeks after sentencing, on a Saturday morning in early June, Catherine Henderson's family visited her grave for the first time since her funeral. Her sister Michelle stood with her parents at the headstone, a simple granite marker that bore Catherine's name, her birth date, and the date of her death, Catherine Marie Henderson. The dates bracketed a life, 43 years compressed into numbers and letters cut into stone. Michelle placed flowers on the grave, white lilies, which had been Catherine's favourite. Their mother, Catherine's mother, placed her hand on the headstone and stood without speaking for a long time. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said. Their daughter was dead. Their grandson was imprisoned. The family structure had been irreparably damaged. What remained was the daily work of grief, the slow process of learning to live in a world where Catherine no longer existed, where the person who'd taken her was locked away for decades, where the only justice available was the cold comfort of knowing that consequences had been administered. The community began a gradual process of healing, or perhaps more accurately, a gradual process of integration. People stopped talking about the case in hushed tones. News coverage moved on to other crimes, other tragedies, other opportunities for public outrage. The neighborhood on Maple Street returned to something approximating normalcy, though everyone who'd lived through the case understood that normal had been permanently altered. Mrs. Patterson from next door had written a letter to the court testifying about Catherine's character. She described a neighbor who was always tired but always kind, always working but never complaining, always hoping that things would improve. The letter had been submitted during the sentencing hearing, and it had been read aloud by the judge. Mrs. Patterson felt, in some small way, that she'd contributed to justice, that by bearing witness to Catherine's humanity, she'd helped ensure that Catherine's life was not simply erased by what had been taken from her. The house at 487 Maple Street eventually sold. The new owners repainted it, removed the old kitchen appliances, tried to erase the crime that had occurred there. But some things cannot be painted over or renovated away. Some spaces retain the memory of violence. Judge Patricia Moore continued her work on the bench. She presided over other cases, other crimes, other opportunities to determine the intersection between culpability and mercy. But the case of Marcus Henderson remained with her. She'd later speak about it in interviews, using it as an example of why accountability mattered, why the system could not afford to treat youth as a shield against consequences. She'd written a detailed opinion explaining her reasoning for the sentence, and that opinion would be quoted in law review articles discussing juvenile sentencing and transfer to adult jurisdiction. The opinion became public record. It became part of the legal landscape. And in that opinion, Judge Moore wrote, "This case demonstrates that age alone cannot determine culpability. A person who deliberately plans to harm another, who documents that plan, who executes that plan, and who then expresses satisfaction with the result, has demonstrated a consciousness of guilt that transcends any developmental excuse. The law must account for youth, but the law must not allow youth to become a mechanism for evading responsibility." Marcus Henderson was transferred to the state correctional facility that housed adult offenders. At 14, he was the youngest person in the facility. He was placed in a segregated unit designed for young offenders, a unit where he would spend his adolescence learning what his arrogance had purchased. The first weeks were difficult. The reality of incarceration, the loss of freedom, the constant presence of authority, the absence of privacy, the noise and the structure, and the endless sameness of days, all of it pressed down on him. He'd believed, right up until the moment the judge pronounced his sentence, that something would change, that somehow the system would recognize his youth and offer him a pathway out. That moment never came. His appeal would be denied. His requests for sentence reduction would be rejected. The 40-year sentence would stand. He was 16 years old when he finally understood that he would spend his 20s, his 30s, his 40s, his 50s in prison. That he would be a middle-aged man before he had any possibility of release. That the gaming console he'd killed his mother for was a trivial thing, a momentary distraction that had cost him his entire life. Catherine's ex-husband, Marcus's father, struggled with his own guilt. He'd been absent from his son's life in ways that mattered, and he'd paid child support but had limited involvement in parenting. He'd missed warning signs. He'd failed to provide the male role model that some argued might have prevented what happened. The guilt was corrosive, though it couldn't compare to the reality of what his son had actually done. He eventually began to volunteer with organizations that worked with at-risk youth, channeling his guilt into something that might prevent other families from experiencing what his had experienced. It wasn't redemption exactly. It was the work of someone trying to extract meaning from tragedy, trying to ensure that his absence from his son's life could at least contribute to preventing similar absences in other families. The final echo of the case came in the form of a documentary that aired 18 months after sentencing. It was a professional production that examined the case from multiple angles: the warning signs that were missed, the system failures that might have prevented the crime, the psychology of the offender. In one scene, the documentary showed Marcus being led through the prison corridor by a guard. He was taller now, his face harder, his expression less expressive than it had been during the trial. The camera followed him as he walked, and then the image froze. The narrator spoke over the frozen frame. Marcus Henderson walked into that courtroom believing he was untouchable. He believed his youth was a shield. He believed the system would bend to him. But authority, true authority, moral authority, legal authority, always has the last word. And that last word, spoken by Judge Patricia Moore, echoed through his entire existence. He is 40 years into a prison sentence. He will spend the majority of his life behind bars. And that smirk that once filled the courtroom with outrage has been replaced by the hard expression of someone who finally understands that consequence is inescapable.